The first snow of November fell silent and heavy across the Montana Territory. Finnegan Walsh woke at dawn, as he always did, to the sound of horses stirring in their paddocks. At 73 years old, his body moved slower than it once had. But his routine never wavered. Coffee first, then the morning feed. The sanctuary animals depended on him, but something was wrong. The air felt different. Too still, too quiet. Finnegan pulled on his wool coat and stepped into the blue-gray light of early morning. His breath fogged in the bitter cold as he walked toward the stables of Whispering Pines Sanctuary, the refuge he'd built with his late wife Alice 40 years ago. They'd saved hundreds of horses here. Wild mustangs, abused thoroughbreds, forgotten draft horses. This land in the shadow of the Bitterroot Range had become their final haven. He saw it before he reached the barn. The paddock gate hung open, the heavy chain cut clean through. Fresh snow had already begun to cover the tracks, but not quickly enough to hide what had happened. She was gone. Freya. His heart clenched. The Nokota mare, slate gray with a spirit as old as the mountains themselves, the last of her bloodline from the Northern Territories, descended from Sitting Bull's own horses. He'd raised her from a starving foal 7 years ago, nursed her through pneumonia that first winter, watched her grow into something magnificent. She wasn't just a horse, she was the last promise he'd made to Alice before consumption took her 3 years past. "Keep the wild things wild," Alice had whispered. "Don't let them disappear." Now someone had stolen that promise right out of his hands. But Finnegan Walsh wasn't just a sanctuary keeper. He'd spent 30 years before retirement as a U.S. Marshal's tracker, specializing in wilderness pursuit. He'd found lost prospectors in blizzards, tracked outlaws through frozen forests, and recovered stolen property across 3 territories. He'd thought those days were behind him. The mountains had other plans. Finnegan knelt in the snow despite the protest in his knees, studying what remained of the scene. Professional work, bolt cutters on the chain, expensive tools, not commonly available, 3 sets of boot prints, 1 dragging slightly, old injury, or deliberate weight distribution. A 4th set, smaller, waiting by what looked like wagon tracks. They'd backed a freight wagon right up to the fence line. His trained eyes caught something else. A small square of fabric snagged on the gate's broken lock. Fine black wool, the expensive kind used in Eastern tailoring. This wasn't random theft by local drifters or desperate homesteaders. This was organized. The snow began falling harder, thick flakes that would erase everything within the hour. Finnegan stood slowly, feeling every one of his 73 years settle into his bones. The smart thing would be to ride into town, wire the marshal's office in Helena, let younger men handle it. But he knew how these things worked. By the time lawmen arrived, organized a search party and gathered supplies, Freya would be across state lines or locked in some wealthy rancher's private stable. The illegal rare breed trade moved fast, and a heritage Nokota mare was worth thousands to the right buyer, more money than most men saw in a lifetime. He had maybe 48 hours before she vanished forever. Before he could make his decision, hoofbeats sounded on the road. His neighbor, Ezra Thornton, came riding up on his old buckskin, his weathered face creased with concern. "Finn! Saw your gate open from the road. Everything all right?" Finnegan gestured toward the empty paddock. "Freya's been taken. Professional job. Happened sometime after midnight." Ezra's expression darkened. "The gray Nokota? Damn it all!" He dismounted, studying the scene with the practiced eye of a former cavalryman. "You planning to go after them?" "I am." "Alone?" "Finn, you're 73 years old. Your heart—" "My heart is my own concern," Finnegan said quietly. "That mare is Alice's legacy. I won't let her disappear into some rich man's collection." Ezra was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I knew you'd say that. Which is why I brought this." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Jerked venison, hardtack, coffee. My wife insisted when I told her I was riding out to check on you." The kindness in the gesture made Finnegan's throat tighten. "Thank you, Ezra, but I travel faster alone." "I know, just promise me you'll come back. This territory's already lost too many good men to the mountains." Ezra gripped his shoulder firmly. "And if you're not back in a week, I'm sending word to Helena myself." After Ezra left, Finnegan turned back toward his cabin, his decision already made. Inside, he moved to the closet, where Alice's clothes still hung untouched. He'd never had the heart to remove them. Behind her summer dresses, he pulled out a dusty canvas rucksack he hadn't touched in 5 years. His old gear. Maps, compass, field glasses, matches wrapped in waxed cloth. And deeper in the closet, wrapped in oilcloth, the Winchester rifle he'd carried on countless tracking missions. His hands trembled slightly as he loaded it, not from fear, but from age. Rheumatism had settled into his fingers years ago, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. He paused, looking at Alice's favorite shawl hanging on a peg, the blue one she'd worn on cold evenings, sitting on this very porch, watching the horses graze as the sun set. He lifted it gently, breathing in the faint scent that still clung to the wool after all these years. Lavender and sage. "I'll bring her home," he whispered. "I swear it." The old man was going hunting. By mid-morning, Finnegan had saddled his Morgan gelding and covered 12 miles, following instinct more than evidence. The snow had erased most of the wagon tracks, but he knew these mountains. Only 3 roads led out of this valley, and 2 were already snowed in for winter. That left the old freight road toward Missoula, but something nagged at him. The professionals who'd taken Freya wouldn't risk a main road with town sheriffs and territorial marshals. They'd go deeper into the wilderness, toward one of the old mining roads that snaked through government land. He stopped at a turnoff, studying the terrain. Fresh snow, yes, but underneath, there, the faint depression where wagon wheels had passed recently. He dismounted, kneeling to brush snow away with his gloved hand. Horse droppings. Still warm beneath the surface. Maybe 3 hours old. He was on the right trail. The temperature dropped as afternoon shadows lengthened. Finnegan's breath came harder in the thin, cold air. His physician had warned him about strenuous activity at this altitude, especially in winter. His heart wasn't what it used to be. Neither were his lungs, but Freya was out there, terrified and alone, in the hands of thieves who saw her as nothing but merchandise. He kept moving. As darkness fell, he made camp in a grove of pine trees, the kind of shelter he'd used hundreds of times in his tracking days. The routine came back automatically: clear the snow, lay the canvas tarp, build a small fire, melt snow for water in his tin pot. His body ached, muscles screaming from a day's hard travel that would have been easy 20 years ago. He heated salt pork and hardtack over the fire and stared into the flames, thinking about Alice. She would have told him he was a stubborn old fool for doing this alone. She also would have packed his bags and kissed him goodbye, because she understood some things mattered more than safety. Some promises had to be kept, no matter the cost. He pulled out his wife's photograph from his coat pocket, a daguerreotype in a worn leather case, and studied her face in the firelight, her gentle smile, her determined eyes. They'd met in '63 during the war, when he'd been a young scout for the Union Army, and she'd been a nurse tending wounded soldiers in a field hospital outside Gettysburg. "You were always braver than me," he murmured to the image, remembering how she'd faced death daily in those blood-soaked tents, never flinching, never turning away from suffering. Even at the end, you never complained, never asked why. He remembered her final days in vivid detail. The way consumption had stolen her strength piece by piece, until the woman who had once ridden wild horses across open prairie could barely sit up in bed. But she'd made him promise, made him swear on everything holy, that he'd continue their work. "The sanctuary isn't just about saving horses," she'd said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's about preserving what's being lost. The wild bloodlines, the free spirits. When they're gone forever, Finn. Don't let that happen." He'd held her hand and promised. Now that promise was being tested. "I'll bring her home," he whispered to the photograph. "I promise." He fell asleep to the sound of wind through the pines, his rifle close at hand. The second day brought a discovery that changed everything. Finnegan found the first camp just after dawn. They'd stopped here 12 hours ago, maybe less. The snow around the site was trampled, disturbed. He saw evidence of horses unhitched, animals moved and checked. And there, pressed into a patch of sheltered ground, Freya's hoofprint. Distinctive because of the slight irregularity in her left front shoe, a fitting he'd done himself just 2 weeks ago. But what made his blood run cold was what else he found. An empty laudanum bottle, the kind veterinarians used for sedating animals. They were drugging her, keeping her docile for transport. Finnegan's jaw tightened. The dose would have to be carefully calculated for a horse of Freya's size and condition. Too much could kill her. These people clearly had veterinary knowledge, which meant they weren't just thieves, they were part of something bigger. He pulled out his old notebook, the one he'd carried on Marshal cases, and began documenting everything. Boot prints, 3 distinct sets, confirming his earlier count. Wagon, heavy freight type, reinforced axles based on the depth of wheel impressions. Capacity for at least 6 horses. And then he found something that made pieces click together. A brass token half buried in the snow. wet and tarnished, but the engraving still visible. Continental Horse Exchange, San Francisco. This wasn't random theft. This was a professional operation. Finnegan had heard rumors over the years about a black market network moving rare horses, heritage breeds, endangered bloodlines, champion racers, to wealthy buyers back east, or even overseas to European nobility. The Pinkertons had investigated but could never pin down the organization. The operation was too sophisticated, too well connected, and now they had Freya. He studied the trail, leading away from the camp. They were heading northwest, deeper into the backcountry. That made sense. They'd avoid settlements, stick to wilderness land where they were unlikely to encounter witnesses, and probably had a rendezvous point where the horses would be transferred to rail transport. Finnegan checked his supplies. Food for 3 more days if he rationed. Grain for his horse was getting low. And his medicine. The digitalis drops his physician had prescribed for his heart. He'd brought enough for a week, but that was assuming light activity, not a grueling mountain pursuit. He kept moving anyway. The afternoon brought freezing rain, the worst kind of weather for tracking. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Finnegan pushed forward slowly, navigating by compass and memory, following the valley floor where the transport team would have had to travel. His Morgan stumbled on a patch of ice, and for a terrifying moment, Finnegan felt himself sliding sideways. His old reflexes saved him. He shifted his weight, grabbed the saddle horn, and the gelding found its footing, but the close call left his heart hammering irregularly. He stopped, dismounting on shaking legs, and leaned against his horse for support. The pain in his chest was sharp, insistent. He fumbled for the digitalis vial with fingers grown clumsy from cold and administered the drops carefully under his tongue. For the first time since leaving the sanctuary, doubt crept in. What was he doing? A 73-year-old man with a failing heart, tracking dangerous criminals through a Montana winter. He should turn back. Wire the authorities. Let younger, stronger men handle this. But even as the thoughts formed, he knew he wouldn't. Couldn't. Because this wasn't just about a horse. It was about the last piece of Alice he had left, the last living promise. If he let Freya disappear, it would be like losing his wife all over again. And some losses were simply unbearable. Then he heard it. The distant creak and jangle of wagon harness. The doubt vanished, replaced by the cold clarity that had made him one of the best trackers in the territory. He mounted immediately, leading his horse behind a cluster of rocks. The sound came from ahead, maybe half a mile away, moving slow, struggling with the terrain. He grabbed his field glasses and moved forward on foot, each step deliberate and silent despite the crunch of snow. The old training never left: how to move through wilderness without being seen, how to use terrain for cover, how to become invisible. Through the freezing rain, he spotted them. A heavy freight wagon pulled by a 6-horse team, crawling along an old mining road. Behind it, a second wagon, lighter, covered, and 2 riders on horseback flanking the convoy. 4 people total. 4 against 1. And Finnegan was an old man with a weak heart. He watched them disappear around a bend, then returned to his Morgan. His hands shook as he tightened the saddle girth, not from cold but from the realization of what he was up against. This wasn't like tracking a lost prospector or even a lone outlaw. These were organized criminals with resources and no regard for the law. Doubt crept in again. Maybe he should ride for help. Maybe this was beyond him now. Then he remembered Freya's eyes, the trust in them when he'd bottle-fed her as a foal, the way she'd nuzzled Alice's hand in those final bedridden days. Somehow knowing comfort was needed. He couldn't abandon her, he wouldn't. Night fell hard and fast in the mountains. Finnegan kept his distance, following the sound and occasional glimpse of lamplight from the wagons ahead. They stopped finally at an abandoned mining camp, a cluster of dilapidated buildings that had once housed gold prospectors decades ago. Perfect place for a criminal operation. Remote, forgotten, accessible by back roads. He circled wide, approaching from the hillside above the camp on foot, leaving his horse tethered in the trees. The climb nearly killed him. His chest burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Twice he had to stop, hand pressed against his ribs, waiting for his heart to steady. He fumbled for the small vial of digitalis in his pocket, placing 3 drops under his tongue as the physician had instructed. Alice, I'm too old for this, he thought. But he kept climbing. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could see the entire camp through his field glasses. The wagon had been backed up to one of the larger buildings. 3 horses were being unloaded. No, 4. Freya was the last one brought out, her head hanging low from sedation. Finnegan's grip tightened on the glasses. They had other horses. This was a collection point. He counted the people moving around below. 7 now, 3 more had been waiting at the camp. They worked with professional efficiency, leading horses into the building, setting up feed and water. Through a lit window, he could see a man in a fine Eastern suit, consulting what looked like a ledger book, probably coordinating with buyers or the next stage of transport. Overhead, the clouds parted slightly, and moonlight washed across the camp. In that brief illumination, Finnegan saw her clearly. Freya, her gray coat silver in the moonlight, being led into the building by a woman in expensive riding attire, the same fine black wool he'd found on his fence. He watched for 2 hours, documenting everything in his notebook. Patterns of movement, guard rotations, the layout of the camp, where they kept their supplies, the coal oil lamps that lit the main building. This wasn't a rescue he could do by force. He was one old man against 7 criminals, but he'd spent 30 years outthinking people in the wilderness. If he couldn't overpower them, he'd outmaneuver them. He just had to survive long enough to do it. The 3rd day, Finnegan made his move. Not a bold assault, nothing dramatic. That's not how wilderness tracking worked. You waited for the right moment, exploited natural advantages, and used the environment as your weapon. And the mountains were about to become very dangerous. The old barometer in his pocket, a gift from Alice 30 years past, showed pressure dropping rapidly. His joints ached with the familiar warning. A major storm was coming. Heavy snow, high winds, temperatures that could freeze a man solid in an hour. The criminals would know this too. They'd either have to hunker down and wait it out or push hard to get out before the storm made the roads impassable. Finnegan bet on the latter. Greed and schedules would outweigh caution. He was right. At first light, the camp erupted in activity. The horses were being loaded rapidly, gear stowed, the lamps extinguished. They were running. Finnegan watched from his ridge position, noting which direction they headed. Northwest still, pushing toward the old territorial road that would take them to the Northern Pacific Rail line. From there, horses could be shipped east to New York or even loaded onto steamers bound for Europe, but they'd have to cross the mountains first. And Finnegan knew something they didn't. The route they'd chosen would take them through Deadman's Pass, a narrow valley where the old mining road was barely maintained. In good weather, it was challenging. In a blizzard, it would be a death trap. He had maybe 6 hours before the storm hit. Finnegan descended from his position, his body screaming in protest. His left knee had swollen overnight, making each step agony. The cold had settled deep into his chest, and he could feel the rattling warning of lung fever starting. But he kept moving. He reached Deadman's Pass 2 hours before the convoy would arrive. The valley was exactly as he remembered, narrow, winding, with steep walls on both sides. The road here was treacherous even without snow, carved into the mountainside with barely enough room for one wagon. This is where he'd stop them. Using what remained of his strength, Finnegan dragged fallen timber across the road at the narrowest point. Not a complete blockade. They'd be able to clear it eventually, but enough to slow them down significantly. While they were stopped, distracted, dealing with the obstacle, he'd have his chance. The wind picked up. The temperature dropped. The first flakes of the storm began to fall. Finnegan positioned himself on the high ground, where he had a clear view of the road below. He checked his Winchester, then checked it again. His hands were nearly numb despite the wool gloves. He settled in to wait, and for the first time in 3 days allowed himself to think about what happened after this, assuming he survived. Assuming he could actually pull this off. He was too old for a gunfight, he thought with grim humor, and too stubborn to quit. The sound of wagon wheels and horse hooves echoed through the valley. They appeared through the swirling snow like ghosts, the 2 freight wagons and mounted outriders, moving slowly through deteriorating visibility. Finnegan watched through his rifle scope as they approached the blockade. The lead wagon stopped. Men dismounted to assess the situation. This was the moment. But Finnegan didn't move yet. Patience. Wait for the right opening. They began clearing the timber. All 7 of them emerged, focused on the task. The horses in the wagons shifted nervously. He could see the movement even from this distance. Then the storm hit with full force. Visibility collapsed to almost nothing. Wind screamed through the valley. The temperature plummeted so fast that Finnegan felt ice forming in his beard. The criminals panicked. He could see it in their body language. The sudden frantic gestures, people scrambling back toward the wagons. The storm had caught them exposed and vulnerable in the worst possible place. One of the men tried to get the horses moving, but the team balked in the blizzard conditions, ears pinned back in fear. They were stuck. Finnegan descended from his position, moving through the whiteout conditions with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in these mountains. The storm that trapped them was his ally. He reached the freight wagon first. Through the chaos of wind and snow, he could hear the horses inside, frightened, stamping, calling out in distress. He worked quickly, his frozen fingers fumbling with the gate latch. The door swung open. Freya was there, her eyes wide with fear, but, yes, recognition. She knew him, even through the sedation and terror. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "I've got you." But freeing her was only the first step. Getting her to safety in a blizzard was something else entirely. A shout cut through the storm. One of the thieves had spotted him. Finnegan didn't hesitate. He fired a shot into the air, a warning not to kill, and the crack of the Winchester echoed like thunder through the valley. The criminals scattered, diving for cover behind the wagons. He grabbed Freya's lead rope and began moving, pulling her away from the wagon. The other horses followed, their herd instinct overriding their fear. 3 more heritage breeds, all stolen from ranches and sanctuaries like his. Behind him, more shouts. The crack of pistol fire, wild shots in the storm that came nowhere close. The thieves were regrouping, realizing what was happening, but the storm was now a complete whiteout. Visibility was less than 15 feet, and Finnegan knew exactly where he was going. There was a cave system he'd used for shelter decades ago, during his Marshal days. Quarter-mile from here, on the east wall of the valley. If he could reach it with the horses, they could wait out the storm while the criminals were trapped in the open. It was the longest, hardest quarter-mile of his life. Every step was a battle. The wind tried to knock him down. Snow built up so fast he could barely see Freya's dark shape ahead of him. His chest burned with each breath, his heart hammering irregularly. He fumbled for the digitalis vial, but his fingers were too numb, too clumsy. It slipped from his grasp and disappeared into the snow. Alice, he thought. If this is where I die, at least it's for something that matters. The pain in his chest intensified, spreading down his left arm. His vision began to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. He stumbled, went to one knee in the deep snow. This was it. This was how it ended. But then he felt it, Freya's warm breath on his face. The mare had stopped, turned back, and now stood over him, her presence solid and real in the chaos of the storm. She nickered softly, the sounds somehow cutting through the wind. And Finnegan remembered. This was the same mare he'd saved from death 7 years ago. The starving foal he'd bottle-fed through that first brutal winter. The wild spirit he'd gentled with patience and love. Never breaking her, only earning her trust. She wasn't going to leave him any more than he'd leave her. He gripped her mane, used her strength to pull himself upright, one foot in front of the other, one breath at a time. The cave couldn't be far now, and then, through the screaming wind, he saw it, the dark mouth of the cave, exactly where memory promised it would be. He pulled Freya inside, and the other horses followed. The sudden absence of wind was almost shocking. They stood, in the entrance, all of them breathing hard, steam rising from their bodies. Finnegan collapsed against the cave wall, his vision going dark at the edges. His heart was doing something wrong. He could feel it, the irregular rhythm, the pain spreading across his chest and down his left arm. He tried to call out, but no sound came. And then there was nothing but darkness. He woke to warmth. Freya was pressed against him, her body heat keeping him alive. The other horses had formed a semicircle, creating a windbreak with their bodies. Some ancient instinct had told them the old man needed protection. The storm still raged outside, but the cave was relatively sheltered. Finnegan checked his pocket watch. He'd been unconscious for 4 hours. His entire body felt like it had been beaten with hammers, but he was alive. More importantly, so was Freya. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. The horses stirred but didn't move away. They'd bonded to him in their shared survival, this old man who'd risked everything to save them. Finnegan managed to start a small fire, using the matches from his coat and some dry kindling that had been stored in the cave. Left there, perhaps, by some other traveler decades ago. The warmth was meager, but precious. He had no way to call for help, no telegraph here in the wilderness, no way to send word. He could only wait for the storm to pass and hope his strength held. In the firelight, he pulled out Alice's photograph again. Her face smiled at him across the years, unchanged, eternal. "We did it, my love," he whispered. "We saved her." The storm lasted 18 hours. When it finally passed, the world was transformed. 3 feet of fresh snow blanketed everything. The temperature had dropped to what felt like 40 below. In conditions like these, exposure would kill within an hour. But Finnegan and the horses were safe in their cave, insulated by body heat and sheer determination. At dawn on the fourth day, he knew he had to move. His food was gone. The horses needed proper feed and water. And somewhere out there, 7 criminals were either dead from exposure or trying to make their escape. He led Freya and the other horses out of the cave. The sun was blinding on the fresh snow. The valley below was a pristine white wilderness, and there, half buried in snow, were the 2 wagons. Abandoned. Finnegan made his way down carefully, leading the horses. When he reached the wagons, he found what he expected. The criminals had fled on foot when the storm hit, taking only what they could carry. They'd left everything. The wagons, the harness horses, the evidence of their operation. He found tracks leading east, toward the territorial road. 7 sets of boots, stumbling through waist-deep snow. They wouldn't make it far in these conditions. But that wasn't his concern anymore. Finnegan hitched the horses to the lighter wagon. They were trained draft animals and accepted the harness easily, and began the long journey home. As Morgan trotted alongside, faithful as always, it took 3 days to reach Whispering Pines Sanctuary. The town had given him up for dead. His neighbor Ezra had already contacted the marshal's office to report him missing. A search party had been organized but hadn't yet departed due to the severe weather. So when Finnegan Walsh came riding down Main Street at sunset on the 7th day, leading a wagon full of stolen horses and evidence of the largest rare breed smuggling ring in Montana territory, people stopped and stared. Word spread like wildfire. By the time he reached the sanctuary gate, half the town had gathered to see the impossible old Finnegan Walsh back from the dead with the stolen horses recovered. The town sheriff met him at the sanctuary gate, hat in hand, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Mr. Walsh, we thought..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know what you thought," Finnegan said wearily, his voice hoarse from days in the cold. "Wire the marshal's office in Helena. Tell them to send men to Deadman's Pass. They'll find 7 people stranded there, along with evidence of the Continental Horse Exchange operation. You'll need a strong party. The snow's deep." Sheriff Hayes nodded slowly, then asked the question everyone was thinking. "How did you do it, Finn? A man your age, alone in those mountains?" Finnegan looked at Freya, standing calmly beside the wagon, her gray coat gleaming in the fading light. "I wasn't alone," he said simply. Ezra Thornton pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You stubborn old fool," he said, gripping Finnegan's shoulder. "You actually did it." "Had to," Finnegan replied. "Made a promise." That night, the story spread through every saloon and parlor in town. The legend of Finnegan Walsh, the retired marshal who'd tracked a criminal syndicate through a Montana blizzard at 73 years old, recovered 4 stolen horses and lived to tell the tale. The rescue party found the criminals 3 days later, all 7 suffering from severe frostbite and exposure, huddled in one of the abandoned mining buildings. They'd survived, but barely. 2 would lose fingers to frostbite. Another would lose his left foot. The operation they represented was the largest illegal horse trafficking network ever uncovered in the Western Territories. The investigation would eventually lead to arrests in San Francisco, New York, and even London.